Good evening, Nice Guy Eddie talking weapons again. This week I want to talk about this piece here. I want to first tell you about how I acquired it, because it's kind of an amusing story. I'll tell you a little bit about the sword itself, and then give a little bit of a review, including some commentary that was made by some other YouTubers that have talked about, believe it or not, this exact sword. So, how did I go about getting it? So, I've mentioned this before. Those who have been following my videos have heard me talk about my marriage, my ex-wife, my divorce. This will be the last time I mention it, because this is really the last time that it's relevant to what we're talking about. This is the last piece of my collection that still has any story connected to the fact that I was married or the fact that I was divorced. But I'm going to give my PSA one final time. If you're going through a divorce, please remember and please realize this too shall pass. It will take time. You will need to heal, but once you do, both you and your significant other will be happier. I promise it's coming. Just give it time, be patient, and you will be happier in the long run. Take my word for it. So, towards the end of my marriage, we were not actually yet divorced officially. We had agreed to get divorced. We'd started the process. We had agreed that we would start dating. Yes, I'm getting to the point. Don't worry. We'll get to the sword in a moment. Bear with me. My ex-wife and I agreed that we could date. We had no problem with that. We agreed we were getting divorced after all. She decided not to date anybody until after it was final. I just went ahead and took advantage of the situation. She gave me permission, so I went and dated. I was very surprised, and I was always honest. I was always honest with people. I was very upfront. Yes, I'm not actually divorced yet. It's still going through. And I was very surprised to find out that was only a problem one time in about a year of dating, and I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen, I don't know, somewhere between 10 and 20 dates slash very short relationships. It was only an issue one time where I mentioned, oh, by the way, I'm not fully divorced, and it was like, boom, whoa, she disappeared fast. I really thought it was going to be a problem more often. Anyway, the reason that's all relevant is because I was seeing, well, not really seeing, but I'd been out with her maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 times, a girl named Kristen. And we, like I say, the 4th or 5th time we got together, we went to a place called Canterbury Village. This is in Lake Orion, Michigan. And how to describe it, it's kind of a miniature Frankenmuth Bronner's type place. If you're familiar with that, it's like Christmas year-round kind of a place. It's like a miniature version of that, crossed with like a miniature Renaissance fair, crossed with like miniature, just like arts and crafts, kitschy type stores. Fun place, good place to take somebody on a not necessarily a date, but just to hang out. You can eat there and whatnot. And we're in Canterbury Village. She was looking for like Christmas decorations, so I guess it was just before Christmas of 16. She was looking for Christmas decorations. I was just along for the company, basically, just hanging out with a girl that day. We're looking around, and we go into this one store. It was in a big building. It was actually 2 stores, one on each side. Each store had 2 floors. And she's looking at garlands and trees and little glass balls and ornaments and nutcrackers and all kind of wreaths and Christmassy stuff like that. And I go, I'm on the 2nd floor, way in the back, around a corner, with like stuff that's not even like arranged on shelves anymore. This is all the forgotten shit way in the back of the store. And I get around this corner, and hanging up on the wall, up high, I see 2 swords. And I'm gonna put this one down for a moment. I was raised by Italians. I have to tell stories with my hands. So I see these 2 swords up on the wall, hanging up high, out of my reach. Good maybe 6, 7 feet up, well, 7, 8 feet up. Maybe it's too high to reach. And one of them was this absurd, ridiculous fantasy sword with a big, thick, chunky blade polished to a mirror finish with serrations and curvy bullshit and decorations all down the blade, and a gold hilt with a mirror finish and plastic gems inset into the hilt. And I'm sorry, it's like, oh my God, this is not only leaving the realm of historical reality, but this is leaving the realm of good taste. I hate swords like this. I hate decorative swords. I mean, I don't mind a good, El Cid, Tizona and Colada type thing. I don't mind a good old Jamie 1. I don't mind a wall hanger. I don't even mind an Excalibur, whatever. But this thing looked like the bastard child of Conan the Barbarian and a Las Vegas showgirl. It was shiny, curvy, fantasy, plastic gem inserted bullshit. The kind of sword that I just like, it almost makes me angry that it exists. I hate swords like that, I really do. If you like them, that's fine. That's just, they're not for me. They're not for me. And next to it was a very simple, elegant looking sword in a leather sheath just hanging up there. And I think, hello, that actually looks like something I might want to see. So I get the sales girl, tiny little thing, about 4'11", and I say, hey, I'd really like to take a look at that sword. And she's like, well, hold on, I'll go get a stepladder. And about 20 minutes later, this was not that big a store, and I thought she was going to go around the corner, grab a step stool or a step ladder, come back, give me the sword. No, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes go by, and I'm beginning to feel bad. Because I kind of know deep down, I have no intention of buying this sword. I didn't come here to buy a sword. I came here to hang out with a girl. I wasn't going to buy this sword. And this girl is going all over Tarnation looking for a stepladder for me. I felt terrible. So she gets the stepladder. She gets the sword down, and I hold it in my hand, and I swing around a little bit, and I'm like, damn, it's kind of a nice sword. Now, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what type of sword it was. I'm like, rapier, saber? No, that wasn't quite right. It's not really any of those. It didn't have a label on it, and I didn't know anything about the maker or the brand or anything. I knew nothing about the sword. I did know that it had some decent flex to it. It did flex. It has a good weight, and it seemed to be well put together, just from what I could tell. And I just liked the style of it. It was simple, elegant, just nothing. None of that fancy, serrated, concave, curvy bullshit that was going on with the other sword. It didn't exactly, not like the arming sword where I picked it up and I said, whoa, this practically swings itself. It just felt nice and lively and a nice little, you had good point control. The weight seemed pretty good. And I thought, yeah, okay, I do like this sword actually. How much do you want for it? And she says they're selling it for $300. Now, and I'm going to put the sword down again, but it is a little bit, it does get heavy after a while. I'll explain that later. She says she wants $300 for it. And now let me explain to non-sword collectors or beginners, $300 for a real sword is not a bad price. You get a decent sword for $200 to $300 range is kind of the bottom limit of anything that's real. Okay, so it might sound like a lot to some people. To a sword collector, $300 isn't that much. But the thing is, I didn't have half my collection at the time, so I wasn't a really serious sword collector. The other thing is, I didn't go there to buy a sword. I certainly didn't go there to spend $300 on a sword. I went there to hang out with a girl, maybe buy her dinner. That's what happened. I was not there to buy a sword. So I'm like, oh, $300, huh? Well, it's nice, and I do really like it, but I'm like, yeah, for $150. I'm buying this thing all day long, but I'm like, for $300, yeah, no, I'm out. I'm not interested. And that's when Kristen, and this is why this is relevant, Kristen says to both of us, or says to me, but loud enough the other person can hear it, well, would you pay $200 for it? And it was like, poof, this chubby little blonde in like a red negligee with horns and a tail and a pitchfork appeared on my shoulder. Would you pay $200 for it? And I looked to the other shoulder, and of course this one's nowhere to be found, like usual. And I'm like, you evil bit. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? $200? I would. So partner in crime here did the negotiating for me. And the little sales girl says, well, I don't know if I can do that deal. I'll go find my manager, see what he says. Okay, fine, we're going to be shopping, we won't go very far. We actually were in the other store in the same building when she comes running back saying, hey, you the guy that wanted the sword? And I'm thinking like, no, I didn't want the sword. I just kind of got roped into it. But yeah, I'm the guy, $200 for the sword. She's like, yeah, manager will do it. And so $200 out the door. Now, I did mention at the time, I didn't know what it was. And I actually had a hard time finding out what it was, but I eventually did find out through, just internet research and watching other people who had done reviews on, I knew it was a basket hilted sword of some kind. So I did some research, found a few videos, and by very carefully studying the geometry of the basket itself and some of the features that I'll talk about in a moment, I was able to determine that this is in fact a Hanwei sword. This is a Paul Chen Hanwei Scottish basket hilted backsword. And this is the one with the antiqued finish. And that's kind of important because one of the reasons I couldn't really figure out what this was is I couldn't find it anywhere. Nobody had a sword like this. Not, you know, Cult of Athena, Medieval Collectibles. Nobody had this sword. However, some people did have a very similar sword. They have a Scottish basket hilted backsword with what they call a bright finish, or at least some of the websites I found it on, maybe not all of them, called it a bright finish. And basically the basket was like a silver plated or nickel plated, very polished, very shiny. The brown pouch here that my hand is sitting in was bright red. The tassels down here were red. And I think the blade might have been a little bit more of a silvery mirror finish, a little polished up, a little bit newer looking, very shiny. If I had seen this sword, I might have passed it up. I think I established my description of the other fantasy bullshit sword that was up there that I'm not a big fan of really shiny stuff. Like, I like a nice, elegant, realistic looking, you know, functional looking finish, and that's what I got with this. But studying it very closely, looking at the individual, you know, the pieces of the basket, these bars in here, looking at how where they curve and all that. The blade is somewhat distinct, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And also these plaques on the front of the horned beasties. The horned beasties, when I look at them, well, I'll do a zoom in on them. And as you can see, they look a little bit like a Medusa almost, but it has a beard, and Medusa does not have a beard. Don't want to assume anybody's gender, but Medusa does not have a beard. So it was through those features that I was able to determine what the sword was. And the fact that everyone seemed to have this bright version of it, and I had the antique version of it, kind of piqued my interest. I did a little more digging. I did eventually find this exact sword, the Hanwei, Paul Chen Hanwei Scottish basket hilted backsword antiqued version. I found this on battlemerchant.com and celticwebmerchant.com. Both of these sites are out of Europe. They were asking 490 euros for this sword, which for those in the States who, you know, don't do metric, that's 585 US dollars. So just shy of 600 bucks, and that's before it shipped. That was the list price on their website. And in both cases, they were sold out. So I bought something that they were listing for almost $600. Granted, in Europe, and I do get the feeling Europe maybe the prices are a little higher than in the States, but still, I paid 200 bucks for it. So I feel like I got a pretty good deal, especially because this appears to be, and don't quote me on this, but this appears to be either a limited edition or maybe something that's been discontinued. But it's hard to find. Now, TigerMasters.com did have the identical sword, but the sister piece with the bright finish. They were listing that for $533. Medieval Collectibles has it listed on their website at the moment for $427. And Cult of Athena, it has this sword for $347, and the broadsword version, which is an identical sword with the basket hilt and everything else, except that the blade is a little bit, it's about double the thickness and has an edge on both sides. One of the biggest differences is that the backsword only has an edge on one side and is blunt on the other side. The broadsword, the basket of the broadsword has a blade on both sides. The word broadsword does get thrown around a lot. A lot of people might think like this was a broadsword, my arming sword, but a broadsword officially would be a sword like this but with an edge on both sides. This is a backsword. The edge of that's closest to you is just dull. So again, ranging in price from 533 US down to 340 US, all for the bright version, which seems to be more common. And I paid 200 bucks for this. So I'm pretty happy about it. Let me tell you a little bit about the sword itself. So some of the distinctive features of it, the blade features twin fullers. So it has two fullers in the blade going all the way down. On the back side, and I'll hold that up, it has a wire-wrapped faux rayskin handle on the inside. Twin engraved horned beasties plaques on the basket. We've talked about that. And check this out. Inscribed into the blade, Andrea Ferrara. Now, Andrea Ferrara, for those who don't know, he was an Italian sword maker who was very popular in Scotland. He actually went to Scotland and was making swords there. And his name was engraved on every Scottish broadsword and backsword that was of particularly high quality. I'm not saying this one meets that stuff. I'm just saying that it was a little attention to detail that they inscribed his name down here. His method of manufacturing wasn't really that well known, but most people are speculating that he would layer layers of steel and iron, and the result was a blade that was extremely flexible, but also extremely strong and would never break even on horizontal blows. So, you know, kind of a neat little attention to detail that they inscribed Andrea Ferrara into the twin fullers there. It did come also with a leather scabbard, which is a nice touch. It's not the best thing in the world, but it's certainly not the worst, and it's it's pretty stiff. So it's not a sheath; it's a scabbard for sure, even if it is made of leather. The blade length is approximately 33 inches. Overall length approximately 40 inches. The weight is just over 3 pounds. It's actually 3 pounds 2 ounces, or 3 1/8 pound. That makes it a little bit heavier actually than my arming sword. The point of balance is 2.75 inches from the guard. Now, getting back to the arming sword, it was 4 inches from the guard. This is less than 2.75 inches from the guard. And that's kind of important to the style of sword that it is, because the further out the balance point is, the more powerful a cut you can deliver, but you lose point control. So you gain that point control with this by having more of the weight down in the hand. And it's a longer blade than the arming sword. So, well, why is the point of balance so close? I think it should be pretty obvious. All of this, this sort of iron boxing glove that you're holding on to down at the bottom, brings all of that extra weight down right around your hand. Gives you excellent balance, excellent point control, but to be fair, at the cost of a more powerful cut. The blade material is 1566 high carbon steel, and they again reiterate with the antique finish. Now, 1566, according to Cult of Athena, I'm going to read directly from their website. Primarily used by Hanwei, this high carbon steel has around 0.6 to 0.7 carbon content with a substantial amount of additional manganese, 0.85 to 1.15. This combination creates a deep hardening steel due to its high degree of hardenability. When tempered, it will have a largely uniform hardened microstructure, which creates a blade both hard, tough, and well suited to holding a sharp edge in extended use. Now, just before I continue with that description, and remember that, I hope you were listening. The blade width at the guard is just over 1 5/8 inch, and the blade, it narrows to a blade at the tip, a blade width at the tip of about 7/8 of an inch. Likewise, the thickness at the guard is about 1/4 inch, and that tapers down to about 1/8 of an inch at the tip. So, unlike a lot of modern replicas of swords, it does have distal taper, and that's another feature that brings the weight closer to the hand and helps bring in that point of balance to just be, I mean, right off. You can kind of see it's right about there, you know, just right about there, really close to the hilt. And the blade almost feels, I mean, the whole piece has mass, but the blade almost feels weightless, just relative to what you're holding in your hand. So how does it work? Is it good? Is it a good sword? Okay. Cult of Athena rates the edge as sharp on the bright version that they're selling, the one with the bright finish. Skallagrim did a video on that very sword. I think he had the broadsword version. But he actually has an excellent video, and I'll put a link, or I'll put the name of the video down below, maybe the link down below. And he describes it as the typical Hanwei edge, which is laughably dull. So Cult of Athena says it's sharp, Skallagrim says it's laughably dull, and Nice Guy Eddie says the truth is somewhat in the middle. Now, when I got it, when I brought it home, I didn't try doing the old, cut the paper test or anything like that. So I don't actually know how sharp it was when I got it home, but I did have it professionally sharpened at one time. Had a guy come out to the house. He did my arming sword, my back sword. He did several of my axes, not my axes. I'm talking about axes up in my garage, actual working tools. He sharpened some of my pruning shears, some of my other gardening tools, and he sharpened my machete. He did an excellent job with all of those. Now, he also sharpened this, and after he did sharpen this, it was able to cut the paper quite easily. Since then, all I've done with this sword is this. Oh. That wasn't so good. Okay.
The king's too fat for his armor.
It never gets old, does it? I'm sorry. Two things have happened since I did that little bit of yard work, cutting down stalks of dried out stalks of sunflowers with this sword. I've since lost 15 pounds, and my sword has... Oh, well, that wasn't so bad. That was the first time. This actually, but you can kind of see my sword. It cut. I got lucky on that one. My sword is just about all but completely lost its edge. It did cut that one time. I'm actually a bit surprised, but you can see it's gotten noticeably duller. And in fact, it doesn't even pass the finger. It barely, some sections of it, but most of it doesn't even pass the fingernail test anymore. Well, what happened? It's possible that the Hanwei edge is in fact, as Skallagrim describes it, laughably dull. But why was I able to cut I'm surprised it cut that time just now. But I cut it before, it cut very easily. So clearly it can hold an edge. Maybe maybe there's something defective in the steel. Maybe that's why it was at a Christmas shop in Lake Orion, Michigan, and not being sold by an actual sword dealer. Maybe it's a defective piece. That's possible. You know, maybe my technique cutting down those flowers was horrible. That's certainly possible. Maybe the guy that sharpened it didn't do that good a job. Also possible. I don't know why the sword got so much less sharp than it was a month ago, not that long ago. I don't have any explanation for that. Now, that being said, this is more of a thrusting weapon than it is a cutting weapon. I mean, again, that's with the point of balance being down there, and the tip, you can kind of see the tip there, and the back edge. I mean, it's not really a cutting sword. I would never try to cut tatami with it, largely because the blade is so thin, meaning thin in the profile direction, that if your cut wasn't perfect, and y'all know my cut won't be perfect, you're going to bend the shit out of this thing. I think I would end up just destroying the sword. I have no confidence that I would be able to cut tatami with this. But, you know, cutting paper should have been not that difficult. Especially when all I did was mow down some sunflower stalks with it. That shouldn't have done that much damage to the blade. So again, I don't really have an explanation for that. But do I still like the sword? Well, if I'd have paid upwards of $600 for it, no. No, I would not. But for $200 for what I paid for it, I'm still very happy with the purchase. And the very fact that it's a thrusting sword, more so than a cutting sword, means that the sharpness of that edge isn't really all that important. It's nice to have, but it doesn't necessarily ruin the sword that this is a little bit more dull. And I just thought it wasn't completely dull as I thought when I started the video. I actually thought I was going to completely fail to cut the paper. It cut a little bit, but yeah, no, it's not sharp anymore. But that's not necessarily the end of the world. But let's talk about the function of the sword and the fact that it's more of a thrusting weapon and a cutting weapon and what that all means. Now, I'm going to get my arming sword out a moment because I have to demonstrate a few things here. Okay, and it's just going to be easier to do on a sword with more of a standard, not exactly a cruciform hilt, but you get the idea. Okay. If I'm fighting, okay, one of the things you might notice, especially if I'm an amateur, I'm fighting like this, and I'm throwing cuts like this, what am I leading with? What is way out here, completely vulnerable? My hand! My hand! And my hand is kind of important if I'm a swordsman. Just ask Jaime Lannister. And if my hand is not well protected, and I'm in fact throwing a cut, and you're supposed to throw a cut like this. You're supposed to lead with the blade of the sword. You're supposed to lead with the tip of the sword. You should keep the blade out ahead of your hand when you're fighting. But, you know, the hacker like me might come in and do one of these. And my hand is out here exposed. Hand protection, very critical. And one of the flaws when you just have a simple cruciform cross hilt, or, God, it's even worse if you've got an axe or a polearm or a katana where your hands are just completely open. And those who have done tournaments can tell you that the hands are an inviting target. Even though they're covered in tournaments, those still count as points in many cases. So you need better hand protection. And this isn't bad. This has a little ring there. But I mean, really, if they get in under this, my hand is screwed. Well, let's put that down a moment. Obviously, this gives you a hell of a lot of hand protection. I mean, this puts an iron boxing glove over your hand. Speaking of which, I always wondered if you're in that scene in the movie where like your swords are crossed and you're getting pushed and you get that opening to just go BAM! Just pop the guy with it. Again, I'm not going to go up to a heavy bag and punch it until this thing breaks, because this is my backsword. There are many others like it, but this one is mine. And I'd like to keep it in one piece. But in a pinch, you know, yeah, I could see that being useful. In any case, though, it does give excellent hand protection. You'd have to really get a pretty precise hit to get a stab in there. And even if you did get some incidental contact through the basket, this leather padding will give, again, some marginal amount of protection even beyond the basket. Now, Scholar Grim and Scholar Gladiatoria, Matt Easton at Scholar Gladiatoria, both did excellent videos on the basket hilted broadsword and basket hilted backswords in the case of basket hilted broadsword in the case of Scholar Grim, and basket hilted swords in general in the case of Scholar Gladiatoria. And I do want you guys to go watch those videos. They're actually really cool. Now, Skull's video, he actually is doing a review essentially of this sword's sister piece. It's the broadsword, and it's the one with the bright finish. And I'm glad that I went back and watched it, because there were a couple things he said in there that I was ready to disagree with based on my experience with this sword, and that's the problem. He's experienced, I'm not. I'm glad I went back and I paid particular attention to what he was saying, because otherwise I was going to come in this video and try to make a huge counterpoint, and if anybody ever sees this video, I would be savaged, because I would have been wrong. Now, he does admit that this gives you great hand protection, but he talked about the way that it limits your mobility. Now, you might be thinking, well, of course it limits your mobility with the sword, and you have angles you can't cut from. I mean, it completely encases your hand. Well, yeah, but I want to show you guys something. Well, let's get these tassels out of the way. There's this U opening here. The bottom of the basket is completely open. So you can, in fact, you know, put the sword out in front of you. And he was talking about how this type of a sword, it lends itself to having like a hammer grip and not so much a handshake grip. And I was like, what are you talking about? You can, there, look, thrust. What's the big deal? Now, I'm glad I went back and watched his video, because what he was talking about, this is where I need the ironing sword. And I'm gonna get this oval out of the way here. The hammer grip would be like this, and you'd be hitting a sword, again, like a hammer. You know, just bringing it down. But if you're thrusting, if you're fencing, you want to hold the sword more like this, more out, okay? I'm trying to get a better, you know what, we'll go this way, okay? Holding it like this, not like this, where my wrist is bent, and then any force that comes onto the sword as I thrust with it bends my wrist in an uncomfortable way, and also takes away from the power of the thrust. But if I can get almost more of a pistol grip, like if I were to hold it like this, like as if it were a rapier with my finger up here, you know, again, I can keep my wrist much more straight in my thrust. Now, the basket hilt does limit your ability. It doesn't give you a lot of room in there. And it's pretty obvious if I'm holding it like this. I don't know if I have enough ceiling here. I'll just, you know, if I'm holding it like this, I'm going to be hammer gripping it pretty often. Now, can you do that sort of handshake grip? It's not impossible. His video implies, and I'm not saying he made the point, but my interpretation of when I first saw it was that he was saying it was impossible to hold this with a handshake grip. Well, let me show you something. So here we are with a hammer grip, and you can see that that's, you know, my fist pretty much fits in Pretty much just like that. So there's not a whole lot of room. Now if I want to let that fall a little bit and try to get something more akin to what he was describing, you know, you can force your, I can't even really show you, you can force your fingers into position, and you can really, it's just really awkward. And while it's maybe vaguely possible, it's obviously very difficult. And so it's, yeah, as I said, it's really not comfortable. It's not natural. There's not really a lot of room in there to do that. And so it's not really designed for it. And that's a problem, because for what you get for all this hand protection is you trade the ability to hold the sword properly for a thrusting type weapon. And we've already established many times that this isn't really a great cutter. It's not meant for that. So he does make a very good point about that. You know, now he also talks about the angles that you can, you know, and he does a lot of, you know, he's a good swordsman, I'm not. And he talks about, you know, the different angles you could throw a cut from, and you are limited with this, again, because of that basket hilt. These corners do tend to catch, you know, on your arm, and you're limited. Now, does that matter to someone like me who's just going to pick up a sword and stabby and slashy? No. Does it matter if you know what you're doing, though? Yes. And that was the point of his video, is if you actually are trained in rapier fencing, for example, and you pick up this sword and you try to do the same thing with it, it's not going to work. The weight is different. You don't have enough room to hold it properly. You're robbed of proper thrusting technique, and at the same time, you don't really get the benefit of cutting. Now, Matt Easton, Scholar Gladiatoria, also does a video of this, and his video is called the Problem with Basket-Hilted Broadswords and Backswords. Now, one of the cool things I want to say about this, he had an antique example. I believe it was an antique example. He's an antique arms dealer, and when I look at his backsword and I compare it to this one, I was really surprised how accurately Hanwei managed to recreate it. Not identical, not enough that I thought that was what I bought. There were slight differences in the geometry and the details of the basket and whatnot, but overall, the proportions, the style, the leather pouch, the tassels, everything was, the detail was actually really good on this sword. So I have to say, Hanwei did a good job in terms of historical reproduction. Blade? Meh. Now let's talk about the problem with basket-hilted swords. He brought up a different issue with it. Now, I'm going to hold this up so you can see it again. Now, you see where the hilt is. I'm going to get a little bit closer there. So you see where the hilt is. It's inside this cup. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put this on my belt for a second. Hopefully this will work. Give me a moment. All right, so I'm wearing this on my hip now. Now, Matt's point was that one of the biggest problems with the sword, he talks about how difficult it is to draw the sword. And that may not seem that important if you're in the middle of a battlefield and you've got 1,000 angry Scots in kilts already with the swords out, all yelling, bagpipes are playing, you're on your horse maybe, I don't know, everyone's already waving their sword and everybody charges. But the thing is, swords were not just used on the battlefield. They were worn as not just as fashion pieces, but also for self-defense purposes, the way somebody might wear a sidearm or a gun today, at least in the States, not necessarily everywhere, but in the States, you might see somebody carrying a gun. So I might carry my sword for the same reason. And let's say that I'm in a tavern, and somebody says something untoward about my soon-to-be wife, and we're going to have a fight. Okay, we're going to have a fight. And he draws his sword. Now, I don't care if I could have the best backsword, basket-hilted backsword in the world, and he could have some crappy little small sword, but his is drawn. And me, I'm gonna have to, yeah. It's difficult to just reach over and get your hand in there very quickly. Now I think it's pretty obvious, if I just had a cruciform hilt, all I have to do is just grab anywhere on the hilt and I kind of can bring the weapon to bear. But in the case of a basket-hilted sword, I can't just do this. You know, oh, I'm stuck, see? That's not going to work. You have to get your hand into the basket. And it's not that easy to do. You could practice it, sure. But in the heat of the moment, you know, you've got an extra second trying to fit your hand around that hilt. And the other thing is, you might notice every time I do that, I'm kind of glancing down. Now, if I've got a guy coming at me with a dagger or a small sword or whatever, ruffian coming at me, the last thing I want to do is take my eyes off him so I can see where my hand is going. The other thing is that with the long blade, it takes an extra half second to get the weapon cleared. Now, look, the long blade gives you an advantage, okay? It gives you an advantage of reach. The basket hilt gives you an advantage, gives you the advantage of hand protection. However, let's say that those two things make this a really good sword. They don't. They make it a trade-off. You trade off reach and hand protection for, well, things like what Skallagrim was talking about, angles and different attack styles, and also difficulty drawing the sword. Now, how important is that? I could have the best sword in the world, but mine's in the scabbard. And he could have the crappiest sword in London, but his is drawn and coming at me. Who's got the advantage? Well, he does, clearly. If you don't believe me, think of it in a more modern example. I could have the best gun in the world, and if it's unloaded, you could have the worst gun in the world, and yours loaded, yours is still more deadly than mine. A sword that is drawn and coming at you is infinitely more deadly than one that you can't get out of the hilt quickly enough to defend yourself. The other things with the basket hilt, and this goes back to Skal's video, and I'm gonna show this with the arming sword. He talks a little bit about, again, just throwing different cuts and the angle of the hand. But the other thing, and this is why a broadsword is kind of a waste of an edge, because this is an arming sword, it has an edge on both sides. With the basket hilt, you don't need an edge on both sides. First of all, you can't do the old thumb on the blade trick. Now, the reason you put thumb on the blade is you turn the blade and you can now hit with both sides without having to twist your wrist. You, instead of coming in it this way, you come in it this way, and you can attack with both sides. Obviously, I can't put my thumb on the blade. The other thing, the other reason why you don't really need that back edge, let's say, pretend that this doesn't have the little oval in here. Pretend it's just a cruciform hilt. And I'm fighting, and I'm fighting, and I'm fighting, and my edge is getting dull. Maybe I can flip my sword around and fight with the other side. Sure, why not? I mean, you know, could last twice as long in battle. Well, how am I going to flip this around? What am I going to do? Hold on to the basket? No. So there's really no point in having that edge on the back side. That's just another point to drive home about this particular sword design. So it does lend itself to a certain grip, a certain fighting style, and it does limit some of the things you can do with the sword. So that's about all I've got to say about the Scottish basket-hilted broadsword or backsword, but backsword in this case, antique finish by Paul Chen, Hanwei. Again, going back to it, do I think it's worth the money? If you're looking to spend 490 euros on it, no, it's not. But if you can get it for 300 bucks or less, certainly if you find it in a store and you're able to just say, hey, I'll give you 200 bucks for it, I would say well worth it for that price. At that range, at that entry-level range, yeah, you know what? I'm pretty happy with the purchase. So that's about all I have to say about the Hanwei Scottish basket-hilted backsword. If you're finding these videos interesting, please like and subscribe. Next week, we're going to be talking about one of my knives back here that I got on a trip to Hocking Hills, Ohio. Until then, take care.